Have you ever wondered why some people can still take a calm, steady breath at the very end of a long life while others begin struggling for air decades earlier? I am 97 years old, and every morning I become aware of my breathing almost immediately. Not because it is painful or dramatic, but because it is still reliable. That awareness did not come from luck or perfection. It came from watching patterns repeat themselves over a lifetime, patterns that became impossible to ignore. I did not grow up protected from the world. I worked in environments filled with dust, smoke from engines, and polluted air common to cities and industry. My lungs aged like everyone else's. What I did differently was simple and deliberate. I did not smoke. That single choice did not grant immunity, but it removed a major, avoidable source of repeated injury. Over the years, I watched friends develop chronic coughs, reduced tolerance for activity, and progressive breathlessness. These changes did not arrive suddenly. They accumulated quietly, year after year, often explained away as normal aging. By contrast, my own decline was slower and more manageable. I could adapt rather than collapse under stress. When I say protect your lungs, I do not mean guarantee health or eliminate disease. I mean preserving functional reserve, keeping enough capacity so that aging, illness, and environmental exposure do not overwhelm the system prematurely. Before going further, it is essential to state the scientific limits of this idea clearly. To be medically and scientifically precise, avoiding smoking must be understood within clear limits. Not smoking is not a diagnostic tool and cannot determine the presence or absence of lung disease. It is not a cure for chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, pulmonary fibrosis, asthma, lung cancer, or infection-related damage. Avoiding smoking does not guarantee longevity, immunity from respiratory illness, or permanently preserved lung function. It does not erase genetic susceptibility, occupational exposure, environmental pollution, or age-related decline in lung elasticity. What avoiding smoking does provide is more limited and defensible. It removes one of the most common preventable sources of chronic lung injury. By eliminating repeated inhalation of combustion products and toxins, the lungs retain greater functional reserve and adaptive capacity over time. This represents risk reduction, not risk elimination, and that distinction is essential. By the time you live long enough, you stop evaluating health in snapshots and start seeing it as a slow accumulation of consequences. Patterns emerge only when you watch people over decades. That is how my understanding of lungs and smoking was shaped, not by theory, but by repetition. When I was young, smoking was not treated as a risk. It was treated as normal behavior. Men smoked at work, at social gatherings, even during breaks meant for rest. The culture around it mattered because it explains why the damage it caused was so often misattributed. When people began coughing, they blamed the cold. When they lost stamina, they blamed age. When breathing became difficult, they blamed fate. What I observed was different. The earliest signs were small: frequent throat clearing, morning coughing, shortness of breath during exertion that once felt easy. None of these were emergencies. That was the problem. The lungs were being injured gradually, repeatedly, without triggering immediate alarm. Here is where precision matters. Not every smoker I knew developed severe lung disease, and not every non-smoker remained free of respiratory problems. Biology does not operate in absolutes. Genetics, infections, occupational exposure, and environment all play roles. But when I compared groups over time, the imbalance was unmistakable. Smokers as a population experienced earlier and steeper declines in lung function. The damage was not limited to dramatic outcomes like lung cancer. Long before that, everyday capacity eroded. People walked more slowly. Conversations were interrupted by breathlessness. Sleep became disturbed by coughing. These were not isolated incidents. They were cumulative effects of repeated exposure. I also want to address quitting because it is often misunderstood. Many people I knew stopped smoking in middle age. That decision helped. Symptoms stabilized. The rate of decline slowed. But quitting did not restore the lungs to a never smoker baseline. The lungs have limited regenerative and reparative capacity, but they do not restore lost elasticity or structural damage in the way tissues like skin do. Scarred or stiffened tissue remains altered. Doctors later described my condition as having remarkably preserved lung function relative to age-matched population averages. That phrasing matters. It does not imply exceptional lungs in absolute terms. It means my decline tracked closer to what is statistically expected for aging without the added burden of chronic smoke exposure. Another pattern became clear during illness. Respiratory infections affected everyone, but outcomes differed. Smokers struggled longer. Recovery was incomplete more often. Former smokers did better than current smokers, but worse than those who had never smoked. This gradient was consistent and biologically predictable. Smoking also compounded other risks. Pollution affected smokers more severely. Pneumonia hit them harder. Cardiac conditions interacted with lung limitations to reduce overall resilience. Smoking did not act alone. It magnified vulnerability. People often defend occasional smoking as harmless. From a biological perspective, frequency matters, but so does duration. Even intermittent exposure, when repeated consistently over many years, accumulates through dose-time biological effects. The lungs respond to total exposure, not intent or moderation. What I learned is that smoking narrows your margin for error. Healthy lungs provide reserve. Reserve allows recovery from stress, surgery, infection, and aging itself. When that reserve is depleted early, even minor insults can become major setbacks. Avoiding smoking did not isolate me from disease. I experienced infections. I felt age-related decline, but my lungs had not been subjected to a largely preventable form of repeated injury that was not biologically necessary. That distinction shaped my later decades. When people ask if not smoking was worth it, they often frame it as sacrifice. I never experienced it that way. I lost nothing essential. I gained something quiet but powerful: stability. Breathing remained a background function rather than a daily struggle. This is not a moral argument. It is a probabilistic one. Over time, smoking consistently shifts outcomes in an unfavorable direction. Avoiding it does not guarantee health, but it preserves capacity. And capacity determines how well a body adapts as years accumulate. At my age, that difference is no longer abstract. It is measurable in steps walked, sentences spoken, and nights slept without distress. That is what long-term protection actually looks like: not perfection, but preserved function. As the years accumulated, my understanding of health shifted from ideals to mechanics. When you are young, health feels like something you either have or lose. When you grow old, you realize it is something you manage. Protection in that context is not armor, it is margin. By my 70s, the contrast between different aging trajectories became unmistakable. Many people my age were not defined by a single disease, but by limitations. They spoke in terms of what they could no longer do. Walking distances shortened, sleep was interrupted, conversations were paced around breathing. These changes were often attributed to just getting old, but the patterns told a more specific story. Aging affects everyone, but it does not affect everyone equally. The lungs naturally lose elasticity over time. Chest wall compliance decreases. Gas exchange becomes less efficient. These are universal processes. What varies is how much functional reserve remains when those changes occur. This is where smoking revealed its long-term cost. People who had smoked, especially for decades, entered old age with less reserve. Their lungs were already operating closer to their limits. When stress arrived, whether in the form of infection, surgery, or environmental exposure, there was little room to adapt. My own experience was different, not because my lungs escaped aging, but because they had not been subjected to chronic, unnecessary injury. I slowed down, yes. I adjusted my pace, but adjustment remained possible. That distinction matters more with age than strength or endurance. I want to be precise again, because imprecision creates false hope. Avoiding smoking does not freeze lung function. It does not prevent stiffness, infection, or decline. What it does is preserve a baseline. When decline starts from a higher baseline, daily life remains manageable longer. I watched this play out repeatedly during respiratory illnesses. When influenza or pneumonia spread through communities, outcomes followed predictable gradients. Current smokers fared worst. Former smokers did better, depending on duration and intensity of past exposure. Never smokers, on average, recovered more fully and more quickly. This was not coincidence. It was dose-time biology. The idea that lungs simply don't regenerate also needs careful wording. The lungs have limited regenerative and reparative capacity. Alveolar repair can occur. Inflammation can resolve. Some functional recovery is possible, especially after cessation of exposure. However, lost elasticity, structural remodeling, and fibrotic changes are not fully restored, particularly after long-term injury. That is the reality I observed reflected later in medical explanations. Another misconception I encountered was the belief that restraint later in life could fully offset excess earlier on. Quitting smoking is unquestionably beneficial at any age, but it does not rewrite history. It reduces future harm. It does not erase accumulated damage. That difference is critical for honest understanding. People also tend to underestimate the effect of light or occasional smoking. Biology does not evaluate behavior in social terms. It responds to exposure. Even intermittent exposure, when repeated consistently over many years, accumulates through dose-time biological effects. The lungs integrate total burden, not frequency labels. Protection, then, is cumulative restraint. It is not heroic, it is repetitive. It consists of choosing again and again not to introduce toxins into a system already under constant demand. One of the most revealing moments for me came during routine medical visits later in life, when physicians compared my lung function to population data. They described it as remarkably preserved lung function relative to age matched population averages. That phrase matters. It does not imply exceptional biology, it implies absence of avoidable harm. I did not outlive others because I was immune. I outlasted some because my organs had not been asked to compensate for unnecessary injury year after year. The lungs, in particular, benefit from not being forced into constant repair mode. Protection also affected independence. Breathing comfortably meant fewer restrictions. It meant walking without planning rest points. It meant sleeping without anxiety about coughing or air hunger. These are small freedoms when you are young, but they become central to dignity in old age. I am careful not to frame this as virtue or discipline. Many people smoked under cultural pressure, stress, or misinformation. Blame is not useful. Understanding is. If there is one lesson age teaches clearly, it is that systems fail gradually before they fail dramatically. Smoking accelerates that process in the lungs. Avoiding it does not stop time, but it slows unnecessary wear. At 97, I no longer think in terms of maximizing years. I think in terms of maintaining function. Protection did not promise me longevity. It preserved adaptability. And adaptability is what allows life to remain livable as conditions change. That is what protecting your lungs truly means over time, not avoiding death, but avoiding preventable decline. When I look back over 97 years, I don't see a life protected from hardship or illness. I see a life shaped by accumulation, by what was added, and just as importantly, by what was deliberately left out. Avoiding smoking was not a dramatic act. It did not feel heroic. It was a quiet decision repeated often enough that its effects only became clear decades later. Protecting my lungs did not mean shielding them from every threat. I lived through pollution, infections, and the natural decline that comes with age. My lungs changed, as all lungs do. What they were spared was a largely preventable form of repeated injury that was not biologically necessary. That restraint preserved functional reserve, the difference between coping and collapsing when stress arrived. I never expected guarantees, and I did not receive them. Avoiding smoking did not promise immunity from disease, nor did it ensure longevity. What it offered was probability shifted in a better direction. It allowed my lungs to age without being forced to constantly repair damage that did not need to occur in the first place. When people ask what mattered most, I do not point to any single year or achievement. I point to breath, taken quietly, without effort, without fear. Breath determines how freely you move, how long you can speak, how well you sleep. When breathing becomes work, everything else becomes harder. If you are young, protection preserves options. If you are older, it preserves stability. If you are quitting now, it preserves future capacity, even if the past cannot be undone. This reflection is not about perfection or judgment. It is about understanding how small, repeated exposures shape long-term outcomes, and how removing one major source of harm can quietly change the course of a life. This reflection represents lived observation, not individualized medical advice, and does not replace professional clinical evaluation.